Did you know that there are currently 1.5 billion pounds of cheese being stored by the US government in various locations across the US? This is what's referred to as the US cheese stockpile, and today we're going to be diving in to those cheese caves deep underground and discussing why they exist and what has happened throughout history to bring us to this point today and what potentially could happen in the future. Just like with so many topics on my channel, we have to go back in history to understand why we have come to this point where we have 1.5 billion pounds of cheese that seemingly nobody wants. So let's do that. The US government has been propping up and supporting the dairy industry for over a century, and it stems back to post-World War I when there was a surplus of milk. Now, if you go on to the US Department of Agriculture's website, they actually have a whole page dedicated to the dairy industry and the ways in which the government officially supports the dairy industry. In the Aubrey Plaza Got Milk video, we talked about the dairy research and promotion programs pretty extensively, but that is just one of the programs. There are so many other ones, and I could go through every single program, but that would just take up an entire video in and of itself. So I am just showing you on the screen what some of them are, and I will include a link to this page below so you can read more about them if you'd like. In 1946, President Truman enacted the National School Lunch Act, which required milk to be part of every school lunch, and milk is still required to be offered in school lunches. We're going to talk about this school lunch program a little later, but here is the point in history at which that started. In 1949, the USDA and President Truman enacted the Dairy Product Price Support Program, which maintains a minimum farm price for milk used in the manufacture of dairy products. Through this program, the USDA indirectly assures a minimum price for milk by purchasing any cheddar cheese, non-fat dry milk, and butter offered to it by dairy processors at stated prices. These purchase prices are set high enough to enable dairy processors to pay farmers at least the support price for the milk they use in manufacturing these products. This essentially guaranteed dairy farmers that they would always get money for their product amid unstable markets. In the 1970s, there was a national dairy shortage, which resulted in a 30% price inflation on dairy products. In 1977, President Carter decided to step in, and the government provided $2 billion in subsidies to the dairy industry over the next 4 years. As a result, dairy farmers were incentivized to produce as much as possible because they knew that the government would be buying up any excess. So while this was designed to be helpful to dairy farmers in the short term, it quickly had the inverse effect because now there was this overproduction problem. All this excess milk that the government was buying was converted to cheese because cheese has a longer shelf life, and so it made it easier to store than liquid milk. By the early 1980s, the US government owned over 500 million pounds of cheese. While it was mostly stored as cheese, some of the dairy was also stored as butter and powdered milk. And I don't know about you, but this sort of immediately made me think of the sort of long-time vegan adage or frustration about milk powder being added into everything. Things that you would not think would need milk powder, like some random chips at the store or crackers that aren't supposed to be cheesy at all. There's been so many vegan memes and comments about this, and I just sort of now wonder how much of that is because of the government trying to get rid of powdered milk. So like, here, have some milk powder for your whole wheat crackers. Okay, so now we have hundreds of millions of pounds of cheese being stored by the government. What do we do with it? In 1981, Ronald Reagan decides, let's distribute this cheese to the public. That year, then Secretary of Agriculture John R. Block showed up at the White House with a molding 5-pound block of cheese and told reporters, we've got 60 million of these that the government owns. It's moldy, it's deteriorating, we can't find a market for it, we can't sell it, and we're looking to give some of it away. Sounds delicious and nutritious. The cheese ended up getting distributed to low-income communities through the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, and this became known as government cheese. Government cheese became a totem of American culture, signaling both class and nostalgia. So I had never heard about government cheese, and we're gonna talk about why in a little bit, but It was clearly very culturally significant in the US. There are a lot of references to government cheese in rap music.
Every day I'm hustling. What else is a thug to do when you eat cheese from the government?
We go back to dollar hoagies into he should cheat. Or like toast in the oven with government cheese bubbling.
I got hood degrees, cause I'm street like powder milk and government cheese.
I say, God, please, I wish we had more than some government cheese.
There's even a segment in a Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg cooking show in which Snoop Dogg introduces Martha to government cheese.
Listen, did I see a block of
You seen it.
hood cheese?
Yeah, government cheese? Even Wendy know what it is with government cheese.
Yes. I'm a suburban girl with hood tendencies.
Wendy, go grab that government cheese
I'm
out
a
of there.
suburban girl.
Martha, you've never had government cheese?
Where's a knife? Where do you buy government cheese?
You don't buy it.
You have to be on,
You got to be on their special mailing
you
list.
gotta be on the plan.
This is good.
See?
Where do you buy government cheese says so much. Obviously, someone's familiarity with government cheese is going to vary based on their socioeconomic status and also their age. I actually think it's kind of cool that they did this segment on the show and brought awareness to it, but I think just sort of the disparity between Snoop Dogg and Wendy Williams' knowledge of and familiarity with government cheese versus Martha Stewart, it says a lot about our culture and wealth disparity. It's a bit uncomfortable to watch and just a reminder of how people's experiences of culture and food can vary so greatly depending on their socioeconomic status. Government cheese is also referenced in a few comedy sketch shows from the 90s, particularly in Living Color, but also in SNL.
You're gonna end up eating a steady diet of government cheese and living in a van down by the river.
You know, it's clear that references to government cheese are correlated with race and social class. In this SNL clip, the worst case scenario for these white kids would be to end up having to eat government cheese. You know, it's almost used as sort of a morality signifier. Like, if you're good, you'll be over here, but if you're bad, you'll be over here and have to eat government cheese.
My personal favorite, green eggs and the government cheese. I will not eat green eggs and government cheese. I will not eat it because it makes me wheeze. I will not eat green eggs and government cheese because it keeps me from going to the toilet with ease.
Come on, baby, now don't worry. This is America, land of milk and honey. We can always eat that government cheese.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that government cheese.
Right.
What, again? But this is the 5th time in a row. Please, Mama, don't eat the government cheese.
It's really fucked up when you think about who were the recipients of this assistance, you know, this low in nutrition, high in cholesterol, high in fat, high in sodium help from the government. Now, of course, for people who are food insecure, it was very helpful to them, and a lot of people talk about it in a way that they're very grateful that their family had access to it. But this is something that Andrew Novakovic, who is a professor of agricultural economics at Cornell, said in an interview with CNBC.
People talk about food assistance programs as if they were created to help poor people out. And, you know, yes, that's true, but almost all of the major food assistance programs were ideas that came from agriculture because we had too much of something.
People of color have a higher incidence of lactose intolerance. 75% of African Americans, 51% of Latinos, and 80% of Asian Americans are lactose intolerant versus the 21% of Caucasians. As this Vox article points out, because minorities historically have been heavily represented in welfare programs, the government wasn't really doing them any favors for their health. This letter from the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine to the USDA and the US Department of Health and Human Services details how dairy can have disproportionately negative health effects on communities of color, specifically Black and Hispanic communities. And like I said, I think that a lot of people were really grateful to have this help. It probably helped a lot of people feed their families, but that wasn't the primary purpose of it, right? The primary purpose of it was to get rid of it. It started in a way to help out the dairy industry. It wasn't really to help welfare populations. That was just sort of like an added benefit. I had a hard time finding an exact timeline of specifically when this government cheese program stopped, but it seems like by the 90s it had largely gone away. But there was still a cheese surplus. So in the 90s is when the Clinton administration formed Dairy Management Inc. Now, we talked about Dairy Management Inc. super extensively in my Aubrey Plaza Got Milk video, but here we can see it contextualized as really a way for the government to try to continue getting rid of that cheese mainly through partnerships with fast food restaurants. Legal scholar and food oppression expert Andrea Freeman stated that DMI's efforts, quote, impose health costs on Americans generally, but disproportionately harm low-income African Americans and Latinos who live in urban centers dominated by fast food restaurants. And again, we have, largely communities of color being affected by this decision. So if we fast forward to today, we still have a cheese stockpile. It continues to grow year after year. It is currently at almost 1.5 billion pounds. Now, there's something I was pretty confused by, because a lot of headlines and reports that I see refer to this as this is the government stockpile, this is being paid for by the US government, therefore by our tax dollars. But it turns out that the stockpile, for the most part, is not owned by the government anymore. Only about 300 million pounds of it belongs to the USDA. The rest is owned by private companies and stored by the USDA. So technically it's the property of companies like Kraft, Hilmar, Sopra, and other sort of big dairy companies. But if you look at this cold storage report from the USDA, it shows, here's how much cheese we have in the stockpile, and indeed it is almost 1.5 billion pounds. So the government, and therefore our tax dollars, are certainly involved in the refrigeration of the cheese, but exactly how the financials work, I don't think that information is readily available to the public. So why does the surplus keep growing and growing? American milk consumption has dropped from 275 pounds per capita in 1975 to 149 pounds per capita in 2017. But even though the demand for milk is falling, the production keeps rising. And this is something important to note, that although liquid milk consumption is down and keeps decreasing, solid dairy consumption keeps rising. So things like yogurt and cheese are actually increasing, as you can see in this very headache-inducing spreadsheet from the USDA. But the bottom line is that the dairy industry is not doing great overall. In fact, 42% of dairy revenue came from government support in 2018. That's almost 50% of the dairy industry's revenue from 2018. In 2020, the USDA purchased $120 million worth of excess milk. After that, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program provided $2.9 billion more in direct payments to dairy farmers. Current bailout is more than double the funds received by any other agricultural product. If US agricultural products were all one big family, the dairy industry is clearly the favorite child, and also the problem child who continues needing to be bailed out over and over again. To the tune of $43 billion in 2016 and $36 billion in 2017. In 2016, the dairy industry dumped 43 million gallons of milk into fields, animal feed, and anaerobic legumes. This same year, dairy farmers requested that the USDA buy more than 90 million pounds of cheese to cut the country's quote, mountain of excess dairy. This is an excerpt from a 2016 opinion piece in Forbes. The United States, through the USDA, is going to buy 11 million pounds or $20 million worth of cheese. The stated reason is so that taxpayers must pay for the fact that no one wants to buy the cheese that America's dairy industry is making. But we don't want to bolster dairy farms. We want some people to stop being dairy farmers in the face of a glut. That's what the price system does for us. As the price of whatever produced declines, then fewer people are willing to produce it. That's the whole point of this system. It's self-balancing. Our intervention into a market in this manner defeats the entire point of using markets in the first place.
There's also a culture of dependency argument of farmers getting too used to having the government step in and make surpluses go away. At some point, you start asking the question, are farmers making milk just so they can sell it to some government program? Being
bailed out by the government was historically just good business for the dairy industry. Let's not forget that these are not loans. Farmers will never repay this handout. This money goes straight from the taxpayer to the dairy industry whether said taxpayer agrees or not. As I said, the stockpile continues to grow steadily other than a dip in 2021, which was a result of the pandemic, as you can see in this visual capitalist infographic. So this is showing if the US stockpile of cheese was a giant cheese wedge, or what is it called? Cheese wheel is that's it. This is what it would look like, and it shows it in comparison to other enormous landmarks that we'd be familiar with. One of the things that kept coming up in my research was one of the biggest problems with the stockpiled cheese is that it is a heavily processed American style cheese, and Americans, ironically, really don't like American cheese that much anymore. In August of 2020, the USDA announced the Cheese Purchase Program for the National School Lunch Program and other federal food assistance programs like food banks. Toward the end of the Trump administration, they scaled back the nutrition regulations for school lunches. This included decreasing the sodium limits and reducing the whole grain requirements. The Cheese Purchase Program directly led to schools adding more cheese into their lunches. According to the CNBC video, 40% of dairy consumed in the US comes from children ages 2 to 17. I found that statistic really disturbing because that is this age range at which kids have basically no agency over what they eat. They're basically just eating whatever their parents or schools provide for them. And this inevitably leads to them developing this early taste for and dependence on dairy that is really difficult to unlearn. As many of us know, dairy is scientifically addicting. We're not like giving all this excess cheese to kids because it's good for them. We're doing it because we need something to do with it. But to be honest, the entire school lunch program is pretty corrupt. There's a whole CNBC video about it that is really eye-opening. On top of all of this, dairy farming itself has become an increasingly stressful profession. Small and medium-sized dairy farms in particular are really struggling amid the decreased demand. These farms are often producing and selling at a complete loss. The smaller dairy farms are oftentimes in contract with these bigger dairy producers, and a lot of times they're in this crippling debt that it's pretty much impossible to get out of. According to CNBC, 3% of dairy farms are producing 50% of the country's milk. So it's just totally stacked against the smaller farms in general. More and more dairy farms are filing for bankruptcy, and as a result, there's this growing mental health crisis among dairy farmers. I think a lot of dairy farmers, they're not evil people. They're just doing what in many cases generations of their family before them have done. For a lot of people, this is their family's legacy. This is their inheritance. This is what they've been given, and they have to try to figure out a way to make it work. Instead of the US government continuing to bail them out, why aren't there policies in place to help them transition to whatever is next? It just seems like the way that we've been helping them is not actually helping. We're just pushing this problem along, and the only thing we're helping them to do is getting them further and further into debt. And I don't pretend that it is easy or even feasible in many cases for a dairy farm to just transition to crop farming. Obviously, we have these heartwarming stories of dairy farms that have done that. In October, California's oldest dairy farm, Giacomozy Dairy, closed down after 125 years to grow almonds instead. 3 years earlier, Elmhurst Dairy in New York shut down its dairy plant and shifted to offering vegan nut-based milk instead of cow's milk. I remember that being a huge deal when Elmhurst transitioned, and this just reminds me to support Elmhurst products more. I oftentimes don't buy their products because they are really expensive because they're super high quality nut milks, and they also don't have, thickeners in them, so it's harder to froth them up for something like a cappuccino. But this is just a reminder of support Elmhurst more. They did something that's pretty incredible, and gotta put our money where our mouth is. And if we're encouraging them to make these transitions, let's reward the ones who have done so. There are some farms even that are still producing dairy, but then they have also started growing something else like oats. I know that isn't the perfect solution, but I think that could be a really great step. Just sort of committing to transitioning one small piece of the farm and seeing how it goes. And hopefully there will be more programs like this to help farmers. But this is what we need, right? Instead of a $40 billion government bailout in 1 year, how about we allocate even a fraction of that to helping farmers transition if this is something that they want to do? The whole thing about protecting the dairy industry is especially ridiculous when you consider that this is a product that is entirely unnecessary for humans to consume. We're protecting this industry like it's our lifeblood, like it's the key to humanity's survival, when really it's the complete opposite of that in many ways. The dairy industry is destroying the planet, it's terrible for human health, it's horrific for the animals. And not only that, but the writing is on the wall. People are eating less and less of it, and it's going to continue trending in that direction. You just have to wonder, at what point are elected officials going to put their feet down and say no more? It's not actually fixing the problem, it's just very temporary relief, and it's actually all but guaranteeing that the problem will continue to occur. Thank you guys so much for watching. I was planning for this video to be mostly about the cheese caves, but then any research or articles that I stumbled upon about the cheese caves, really everything just led back to the history, and obviously that is really important and something I think we need to learn from moving forward. It's easy to feel really helpless with these situations, but I did see some quote, I don't know if it was a comment on Reddit or if it was a quote from an article, I've done so much reading for this video, but it was saying that this is actually an area where consumers really do have a direct impact. Like, we can choose not to consume dairy. Consumer demand shifting is really what has exacerbated this problem for the dairy industry, and so I feel like we're doing our part. Hopefully the government will start doing its part by addressing this problem differently in the future in a more meaningful and effective way. Thanks for checking out this video. I hope you enjoyed it, found it informative. Give it a thumbs up if you did. Subscribe for more of my videos and make sure to tap the bell so you'll be notified when I upload, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!